The liberal media casts a lot of doubt on the possibility that COVID leaked from a Wuhan lab. For over a year, you were labeled a conspiracy theorist if you dared to even mention it. But after a bombshell report on the hospitalization of 3 researchers from that lab before the outbreak, now all of a sudden they care.
There's new scrutiny on the origins of the coronavirus.
A new report is renewing questions about the origins of COVID-19,
adding ammunition to the theory that the coronavirus may have escaped from a laboratory in China.
Growing calls for an independent investigation.
So, Dana, the White House keeps saying that China needs to do more to get to the bottom of this, which I don't think bodes well for actually learning anything about what happened.
I mean, it would be a shame if we never find out the actual truth. I think at this point, though, it seems plausible, even likely. I mean, unless the Chinese want to show us otherwise, then I think that the rest of the world would be forgiven for assuming that that's exactly what happened. Like, why don't we just flip the tables on them? Like, why are we just assuming that we need this independent investigation? Like, in a way, would they ever do that for us? No. So why should we do that for them? Now, I'm being slightly facetious, but I'm also trying to be devious, because that's really my nature. And when it came to the media, I think everyone just take a step back. In this past 5 years, right, what happened to your judgment when you looked at possible issues that came up? When Secretary Pompeo, who is in a position to know as a Secretary of State, says it's a good possibility that this could have come from a lab, or we have reason to believe it might have come from a lab, why don't you believe him? And think about that. Like, why wouldn't you believe him? And why would you believe anything anyone says now? So one of the things you have to do with reporters, you trust and verify, and then verify again. And I'm glad that the reporters are continuing to do this. I do think this is the biggest man-made disaster, the most consequential one in the history of the world. And even if the Chinese never let people in to find out what's going to happen, everyone's going to think what we already assume in our guts anyway.
Mm-hmm. So, Jesse, part of this is obviously following the money. Dr. Fauci has been questioned a lot in recent weeks about the NIH's funding of this lab, and now he's finally admitting that they gave them $600,000 of modest grant money to study whether coronaviruses could actually infect humans in terms of the bat coronaviruses. And he's trying to kind of get ahead of this narrative we're seeing now of it coming from a lab when he dismissed this idea when President Trump was in office.
Yeah, he changed his answer 3 times now. His agency actually trained Bat Lady to do these types of research things in Wuhan. I mean, they brought her to America, North Carolina, and they trained her there. The media has blown the biggest story of the 21st century. It's a once-in-a-100-year pandemic, killed millions of people, changed all of our lives. A year later, they're getting around to figuring out where it came from, while conservatives on social media knew the whole time because they followed the facts. I mean, they blew Epstein and Weinstein and Trump 2016, the Cuomo scandals, the crime wave. What else? The laptop from hell was a blueprint for Biden family crimes. They care more about what flavor Gatorade he drinks. I had a friend, Katie, who used to say, I assume everyone I meet is a pedophile, and then I work back from that assumption. Now, every time I see something in the mainstream media, I assume it's wrong, and I work back from that assumption. Because when they say something is a conspiracy theory, it just means a theory they disagree with. When they say something is debunked, it hasn't been debunked at all. They just get triggered when someone besides the legacy media breaks news or pursues a story that they disagree with. And then they try to tell everybody it's fringe. It's not fringe. We've known this was likely from the jump. Juan said yesterday that, oh, you know, just because a couple days ago the Journal reported these lab workers got sick, that was a morsel of the evidence that's mounted. I don't know, Juan, if you've seen Water's World for the last year. Probably not. Disappointing. I mean, it would be weird if you put up with me all week and then watched Water's World on Saturday night. But we have been covering this. They did gain of function at the lab. I mean, the Chinese have still not even said what species that this originated from a year later, that this thing actually attacks humans and has never been found in the nature once. That's absurd. Every kind of virus we've ever had, within a month we've been able to say that's the host, that's the intermediate host. A year later, they still can't name where it came from. Don't you think that's odd? Dana's right. The burden of proof's on China.
Yep.
Well, the poor pangolin got blamed for everything, and then the bats are getting blamed. But now that the media has been caught essentially, destroying factual information for the sake of a political narrative, the New York Times is now blaming President Trump for discrediting the lab theory. Let's take a listen.
President Trump and Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, both suggested they had seen evidence that this was formed in a lab, and they also suggested it was not released on purpose, but they refused to release the evidence showing what it was. And so because of that, that made this instantly political. I think that it was, example 1,000, when the Trump administration learned that when you have burned your own credibility over and over again, people are not immediately going to believe you.
Burning credibility, Greg.
Yeah, it's Rich. So this answers the question when Dana says, why wouldn't you believe Pompeo? They wouldn't have diminished the lab theory if it wasn't for their emotional hatred for Trump. Their emotional dislike actually prevented them from logically thinking about this. Who's been pointing out this disorder for 4 years? We have. But now they've just admitted that their own Trump Derangement Syndrome has caused them to trash science and even ignore possibly the most plausible theory. Because when you think about the other theory, right? So if you use the Occam's razor, the most obvious explanation tends to be the truest. They thought that the most obvious explanation it came from a wet market from a pangolin or a bat that was eaten. So that was somehow more plausible than a frickin' lab that is literally down the street doing experiments with novel coronaviruses that are known to not be totally competent when it comes to their hygiene, known for their sloppy work, that could, in fact, allow the virus to escape. What is the more plausible theory? That obviously that one, but we were bullied into it by the media because Trump. By the way, when you put it this way and you think about it, China murdered my father-in-law. Everybody you know that was murdered, changed my life forever, changed my wife's life forever. They are murderers. That government is a murderous government. We know that. So what are we going to do about it? I don't know.